Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, prior to the approval of the budget of the Department of Finance, one member wishes to interpolate the Honorable Chairman. May we recognize the Honorable Marc Douglas Cagas from the 1st District of Davao del Sur.
The Honorable Cagas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. I would agree with the Majority Leader that before we approve the budget of the Department of Finance, this representation would respectfully ask few questions to the distinguished sponsor, who is also my colleague from Davao, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, may I ask the distinguished sponsor, since my friend and my colleague is tasked to defend and sponsor the budget of the DOF, and since the DOF is a member of the DBCC, which also includes the DBM and NEDA, may I just be informed what comes first, Mr. Speaker? Does the NEP, or the National Expenditure Program book, comes first, or the General Appropriations Bill book, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, the budget process starts with, of course, the budget preparation from the Executive Department. The National Expenditure Program, or the NEP, is being prepared by the Executive. And for this year, 3 books were submitted to the House of Representatives. That includes the NEP, the summary of the staffing pattern, and the other is the sources of budget of expenditure and sources of finance. So it's the NEP that comes first, and after the budget deliberations conducted by the Committee on Appropriations, now we have with us the copies of the General Appropriations Act, or the GAA, which is of course subject to the approval of this body.
I would rather call it the General Appropriations Bill, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, Bill.
The reason why I asked our distinguished sponsor, Mr. Speaker, is that yesterday, this representation happened to have a meeting with one of the cabinet secretaries of this administration, and he informed me, Mr. Speaker, that up to yesterday, ironically, to borrow the words of the chairman of the Committee on APRO, ironically, up to yesterday, they did not receive copies of the NEP. May I therefore find out from the distinguished sponsor, is there a pattern? Is there were cabinet secretaries deliberately not furnished copies of the NEP and were limited only to departments which are members of the DBCC, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, in the process, usually, the budget that is given back to the individual departments are their individual or respective budgets. The NEP is the one given to the House of Representatives, where it includes all the expenditures of all the various agencies of the government. And just to add, the departments, of course, have a copy of what they have prepared, because during the budget call, which starts sometime March or April, they make their proposal and submit it to DBM. And of course, they know and they have their copies of their budget. Subject, of course, to the approval of this House in the presented NEP and in the General Appropriations Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pointed that out because this representation was really intrigued. Why? Because as a matter of fact, another colleague of mine from Davao, Congressman Lagdameo, even sent copies of the NEP to other secretaries who requested from us the same. Because they themselves felt that the DBCC was withholding something from them, which the other cabinet secretaries are also supposed to be entitled to have, because they ought to know, not only coming from their finance officers, but coming also from the office of the President, Mr. Speaker, or the DBCC, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, again, the NEP is being prepared by the DBM, which is submitted to us. And we are happy that the Honorable Cagas and the Honorable Lagdameo furnished copies to the other secretaries or the other officials of the executive who were asking for copies. Because actually, what they have are the individual budgets of their departments. The NEP, again, includes all the budget of the various departments as well as the other expenditures, to include the debt service and capital outlay and everything of the various departments.
Thank you. Because if this pattern continues, Mr. Speaker, I think there's inefficiency somewhere here.
I can understand, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps there could be some kind of, I would say, not miscommunication. It's possible that it could happen because during the preparation, it was prepared, of course, with the previous administration. The budget call was during the previous administration, and now it was prepared finally by the new administration. So perhaps copies were not distributed at that time.
Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I don't see why we drag the previous administration as far as distribution of the NEP is concerned. It is not the previous administration who is now responsible for distributing copies of the NEPs or copies of the GABs. But Mr. Speaker, having said all of these things, I now go to my main concerns as far as the budget of the Department of Finance is concerned. Mr. Speaker, my first question would be if the distinguished sponsor would so enlighten me, is to ask what do we mean by an earmark revenue, or what are earmark revenues, Mr. Speaker?
For this year, the earmark revenues for 2010, our total revenues expected is about 1.294 billion. And for next year, it's about 1.410 billion. This is intended revenues to be raised for the year and for next year.
Mr. Speaker, I believe that my question wasn't answered, Mr. Speaker. I was asking what does earmark revenue means, Mr. Speaker. I am very well aware of the figure of earmark revenues. In fact, I have here with me figures from the year 2002 up to the present year. So my question is, what is an earmark revenue, Mr. Speaker?
Earmark revenues are revenues that are covered by laws that already intended to fund for certain purpose.
Thank you. In other words, these purposes, Mr. Speaker, are supposed to be pre-identified. In other words, earmark revenues are, by law, already set aside for pre-selected specific purposes, Mr. Speaker. May I know, therefore, from Mr. Speaker, what are examples of earmark revenues, Mr. Speaker?
The examples of earmark revenues are the MBUC fund, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy that the distinguished sponsor gave as an example the Motor Vehicles and Users Law, Mr. Speaker. The authors of the MBUC must be very, very proficient as far as looking for ways as well as looking for means, because as part of the job of the Department of Finance is looking for ways and revenues to fund ways that would become later on programs and projects of the government. Just for the record, may I simply ask Mr. Speaker, the distinguished sponsor, what agency implements the MBUC, Mr. Speaker?
In the case of MBUC, Your Honor, it's the Department of Public Works and Highways.
Thank you. And
And
what?
the OTC. And the OTC.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what agency is tasked to collect the MBUC, Mr. Speaker?
These are the tax collected from the licenses from the Land Transportation Office.
And Mr. Speaker, what is the lifetime of funds coming from the MBUC?
It is a continuing fund, so it's lifetime.
I could not agree more with my distinguished colleague from Davao. Sir, you are very correct. However, the next few questions about the MBUC is not really for the DOF, but I'll reserve it later on for DPWH, because the MBUC funds coming therefrom should be properly and equitably distributed amongst the legislative districts found within in the country, Mr. Speaker. Now, I have observed, Mr. Speaker, that there are two types of earmark revenues. Would the distinguished sponsor corroborate this statement?
Yes, Your Honor, there are two types of earmark revenues.
Yes, to be specific, earmark revenues are classified into two: the general fund proper and the special accounts general fund. Mr. Speaker, for purposes of information, so that our colleagues as well as ordinary citizens to whom we are accountable to, may this representation be explained as to the meaning of what general fund is and what a special accounts in the general fund also means, Mr. Speaker.
The two types of earmark funds. First is the general fund. This is one that is included in the proposed General Appropriations Bill or General Appropriations Act. And the other earmark revenues is the special account, which is automatically appropriated. In other words, there is an existing law which provides for the specifics of which they are earmarked.
We will go to automatic appropriations later, but I thank the distinguished sponsor. Under the general fund, there is a subheading, quote unquote, the use of income. Am I correct in saying this, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Your Honor. It is provided for in the BESF.
What does use of income under the general fund imply, or what does this include, Mr. Speaker?
May I request the honorable gentleman from the body also to please repeat? Please repeat the question.
All right. Simply, Mr. Speaker, I just want to find out what the use of income means. Meaning, ano ba ang saklaw nito? Ano ba ang napapasaloob sa term na use of income? At ano ho ba ang ibig sabihin ng term na use of income under the provision of general fund, Mr. Speaker?
In the case of the general fund proper, there is a legal basis by which this particular or specific allotments were allocated. So there is, for example, a General Appropriations Act or a Republic Act, and the particulars for which they have been appropriated.
Yes, in fact, Mr. Speaker, the basis of the Office of the Secretary under the use of income, again, under the general fund, the legal basis thereof is Executive Order 282. If we go on further down the line, the legal basis for is EO 1042, and for the Bureau of Customs, the legal basis would be EO 592. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, I have here a copy of, this is practically, Mr. Speaker, a history of the use of income. I'm sorry, distinguished sponsor, I wasn't able to come up with a presentation para malinaw sana na ilagay ko sa screen. But just to say, Mr. Speaker,
May I request, Mr. Speaker, the executive order that was cited by the gentleman from Davao del Sur? The number of the executive order, Your Honor.
no, I'm already asking, Mr. Speaker, the use of income, Mr. Speaker. I'm way past that already, Mr. Speaker. So, as I've said, if I may continue, Mr. Speaker, from 2004, Mr. Speaker, under the office of the Secretary as well as of the BIR, they have more or less similar figures. They have roughly 50 million from 2004, and then 2005, the same 50 million, 2006, 50 million, 2009, 50 million. I skipped 2008 because there was an abrupt increase, Mr. Speaker, from 50 million to the amount of 229.45 million, Mr. Speaker. May I therefore know from the family of the Department of Finance, through the distinguished sponsor, the reasons or reason of this abrupt increase in the year 2008, Mr. Speaker?
Is the gentleman referring to Executive Order number 592, imposing the mandatory payment of container security fee in the implementation of the non-intrusive container inspection system project of the Bureau of Customs and creating a trust fund for the use thereof?
Yes, correct, Mr. Speaker. Executive Order 592, Mr. Speaker, the particulars of which 25% of its income must come from the container security fee. May I just ask from the DOF family through our respected colleague from Davao, the sponsor, why was there an abrupt increase in the year 2008 as compared to the previous years, Mr. Speaker?
Ito yung ginamit sa lolo. Ito yung ginamit sa lolo. Ginamit sa lolo. Pero ito yung
Kahit nag-go po
2006 years.
Itong 592, ginawang 5 and 10. Bumaba.
Oo, hindi siya pwede
Bumaba yung container security.
Sa likod, kumuha ng
From
white seat.
25 to 5. Mr. Speaker, the new Executive Order 592 reduced the fees from $25 to $5.
But
This is partly intended to pay for the loan
And
to
so,
finance the
Mr. Speaker,
$150 million. container van, X-ray equipment.
Thank you, distinguished sponsor. Mr. Speaker, my question would be because in a sort of a balance sheet, Mr. Speaker, we have revenues vis-a-vis expenditures. And I've taken pains in comparing the revenue and expenditure, since we are concerned with the budget of the DOF, from the year 2004 and to 2010 as well as 2011. My question really, Mr. Speaker, was why was there an abrupt increase in 2008 which amounted to 229 million pesos 450? So,
Abrupt increase in collections. May I be clarified, Mr. Speaker? Because as per Executive Order number 592, instead of increasing the fees, it is practically reducing the fees from
that is
$25
precisely,
down to $5.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why I'm asking why under the Bureau of Customs there was an abrupt increase of revenues to 229, this is in thousands of pesos, 229 million pesos, 450, Mr. Speaker. If there
This is what year, Mr. Speaker?
2008, Mr. Speaker.
May I move for 1 minute suspension, Mr. Speaker?
Session suspended.
Mr. Speaker, I am now ready.
Session is resumed.
Mr. Speaker, there was higher income in 2008. There was, the economy was somehow recovering from the Asian economic crisis, higher collections. And the increase in the revenues in the Bureau of Customs was intended to pay for the loan for the X-ray machines that was granted through a loan from the government from the Chinese government, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very glad that the distinguished sponsor mentioned that in the year 2008, when the President was still Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, that there was a significant growth and good collection as far as the Bureau of Customs is concerned.
Yes, Your Honor. And in fact, there was, in 2008, there was, the deficit is smaller because if we remember, this was a kind of a windfall from the VAT that we have because of the, I remember the time that the exchange rate went up. And because of the increase in the peso to the dollar rate, collections in the Bureau of Customs was higher. Importation was higher because the equivalent of the collection was higher because of the higher rates of the dollar at the time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In other words, during the time, the appreciation of the peso, for every peso appreciation, it was an equivalent collection increase of 4.2 billion pesos.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Distinguished Sponsor, for looking for the explanation. I just wanted to point that out that in the year 2008, we had a good year, Mr. Speaker. Let me now go to second part of earmarked revenue. Actually, Mr. Speaker, under special accounts, there are two kinds, Mr. Speaker. First is the annually appropriated, and the second is the automatically appropriated. This representation would only deal or is only concerned with the second, Mr. Speaker, to wit, the automatically appropriated provision under the special accounts, Mr. Speaker. May I therefore know or be informed or apprised as to what the second item means, Mr. Speaker?
In the case of the second set of automatically appropriated or earmarked revenues, there are already existing laws that allowed their automatic appropriation. Like there were Republic Act, for example, Republic Act 9496, which allows the collections from the Bureau of Customs from the importation of agri-products within minimum access volume and proceeds from loan repayments to the amount of which is allocated to the Agricultural Competitiveness Enhancement or ASEF, and all the other laws that were passed that provided the basis for this automatic appropriation.
Mr. Speaker, under the Yellow Book, or I guess this is Book 3, the budget of expenditures and sources of financing, which I practically based my questions, Mr. Speaker, I've noticed the sponsor is correct that there are already existing laws which are legal basis thereof. I've noticed, Mr. Speaker, that there are provisions for insurance commission fund, the pre-need fund, the BIR, the privatization management office, as well as of the Bureau of Customs, Mr. Speaker. I can narrate all the figures here, but this is too long. This is from 2004 to 2011. My question to the distinguished sponsor, Mr. Speaker, is there for automatically appropriated funds of the Department of Finance under the special accounts, kindly share with us or this representation the status of the balances, the revenues, and as well as the expenditures, Mr. Speaker, of those items found under the automatically appropriated funds of the special accounts, Mr.
May I
Speaker.
request a 1 minute suspension, Mr. Speaker?
Session
Just ask for
suspended.
the balance. Revenues as are follows. Under the Department of Finance, the balances of December 31, 2009 for the BIR, PD 1158 and RA 8424, refund of taxes, as of 2009 is 634,994. Later we will provide the 2010 balance, and the targeted or earmarked revenues for 2011 is 1.528 billion. For the Bureau of Customs, under EO 592, EO 230, and EO 563, which is the 25% income from the container security fee or CSF, income from the service fees on shipments of qualified importers using the Super Green Lane facility. The balances as follows: for 2009, it's 173,887,000. 2010, we will provide again later, considering that it's October, so we will try to get the outstanding balance, whatever latest is available data. Earmarked revenues for 2011 are as follows: 101,855,000.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I understand if the gentleman from Davao del Sur has a copy, it's in page 195
Yes.
of the BSF.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason why I asked whether there's a balance or a sort of a balance sheet, Mr. Speaker, because this would lead me to my next query, Mr. Speaker. May I find out if there are GOCCs under the auspices of the Department of Finance, Mr. Speaker? Are there GOCCs under the auspices or the ambit of the Department of Finance, Mr. Speaker?
Under the Department of Finance, the following are the GOCCs: Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Trade Investment Development Corporation of the Philippines.
I understand Land Bank was, when was Land Bank, or let me rephrase, Mr. Speaker, is Land Bank still under the DOF, Mr. Speaker? Or has has its jurisdiction been transferred to some other department of government, Mr. Speaker?
Under the BSF, Mr. Speaker, the Land Bank of the Philippines is under the Department of Agrarian Reform.
And correct me if I'm wrong, was it transferred on 2002, Mr. Speaker?
I will check with the staff, Mr. Speaker.
Meron siya.
Mr. Speaker.
Yes, please proceed. We have the suspended session.
Mr. Speaker, the Land Bank of the Philippines, since its inception, was under the Department of Agrarian Reform and not with the Department of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've noticed, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the distinguished sponsor that he mentioned that Trade and Investment Development Corporation as well as PDIC or the Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation are under the auspices of the Department of Finance, Mr. Speaker. I've noticed, Mr. Speaker, that in their balance sheet, or in their income statement of the two said GOCCs, there is a pattern of non-reporting here, Mr. Speaker. Much as it pained me to go into the waking hours, I couldn't find any regular reporting from the two concerned GOCCs, Mr. Speaker. My question, therefore, would be, are GOCCs under the DOF required by law to regularly make a report, Mr. Speaker?
Land Bank, Mr. Speaker, they have not submitted to the DBM their balance sheet. And for this budget, there is no subsidy. That's why they were not called during the budget hearing, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's required by law, Mr. Speaker, that again, the Trade and Investment Development Corporation of the Philippines, or the PDIC, submit, Mr. Speaker, on a regular basis, Mr. Speaker, a report, Mr. Speaker, of their statement of assets and liabilities, their balance sheet, as well as their income statement, Mr. Speaker.
The financial institutions, which include they do submit their financial statements regularly to the central bank. But if the gentleman from Davao del Sur would wish that we require Land Bank to submit their audited financial statements to this House, then maybe we can ask them to submit, Your Honor.
Mr. Speaker, it is not only my wish, Mr. Speaker. It is not only me that is insisting on a regular reporting by the GOCCs, but may find out from the, at least from the DOF family. You're made of highly intelligent people. What law does... Are we not required by law to make a regular reporting, Mr. Speaker?
In the case of Land Bank, as reported, they do regularly submit their financial statements to the DOF, but it was only in the DBM that they were not able to submit. It was the DBM who prepared this budget, Your Honor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just cite from the official Gazette of 2010, Mr. Speaker, this is under the special provisions, Mr. Speaker. There are three provisions here that for this representation may govern the requirement as to the submission of regular reports. May I read it, Mr. Speaker, for informative purposes? Section 5, Mr. Speaker, submission of corporate operating budgets and other related financial statements. All GOCCs, including GFIs, shall prepare their fiscal year 2010 COBs in accordance with DO number 518, series of 1979, and the procedures and guidelines prescribed by the DBM, and so on and so forth. Section 15 of the same, Mr. Speaker, provides for the remittance of cash dividends. Cash dividends to at least 50% of the annual net earnings of GOCCs shall be remitted to the National Treasury pursuant to RA number 7656 as income of the General Fund. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, Section 16 of the same, submission of quarterly reports, Mr. Speaker, as clearly indicated in the official Gazette, GOCCs shall submit to the DBM. Number 1, to the DBM. Number 2, to the House Committee on Appropriations, Mr. Chairman. Meaning, our Committee on Appropriations of this Congress, Mr. Speaker, and the Senate Committee on Finance, their quarterly corporate financial, fiscal, and narrative accomplishment reports within within 30 days after the end of each quarter. That is why, Mr. Speaker, I pointed out that it's not a matter of letting Land Bank or these concerned GOCCs appear before budget briefings, but it is a matter which is required under the official gazette, which was previously approved by the previous Congress, Mr. Speaker. Let me therefore, Mr. Speaker, go to, as I am about to end, go to next of a very few questions, Mr. Speaker. The topic would be on non-tax revenues, Mr. Speaker. Ang sa akin lang naman po, kasi yung tax revenues, klaro na po yun eh. Ang non-tax lang ho ang medyo hindi klaro sa akin because we are like, in here, in the Department of Finance, we are like in the Ways and Means Committee. We are looking for ways to have revenues and means which should be funded later on. So may I therefore ask, Mr. Speaker, what a non-tax revenue means?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I agree with the gentleman that the government-owned and controlled corporation, as well as the financial institutions, must submit the report, quarterly report. And now that I am a member of the Committee on Appropriations, I would impose and I would do my best that these institutions would submit the required quarterly reports. Mr. Speaker, with the news, fees and charges, the income from the Bureau of Treasury, income from government services, interest on deposits, interest on advances to government corporations, income from investments, interest on bond holdings, guarantee fee, gain on foreign exchange, national government income collected by the Bureau of Treasury, dividends on stocks, national government share from airport terminal fee, national government share from PAGCOR income, national government share from the MIA profit, and other fees and charges remitted to the Bureau of Treasury. Also included are the proceeds from the privatization as well as the proceeds from foreign grants, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very well said. What are, Mr. Speaker, since there is a moral issue here, Mr. Speaker, since DOF is supposed to lead us and to inspire all the GOCCs as well as other executive offices to comply with its mandate, may I thus find out what non-tax measures are being made by the DOF or other GOCCs, Mr. Speaker?
The non-tax measures that's directly under the Department of Finance would include the proceeds from the Bureau of Treasury, the Privatization Management Office, as well as, of course, the income from dividends from the other government-owned and controlled corporations under the Department of Finance.
And may I know the status of each non-tax measure, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, this year, 2010, the following collections are reported as non-tax revenues of the national government. They are as follows: from the Bureau of Treasury, 40.2 billion; from fees and charges, 36 billion; from privatization, 0.4 billion; from grants, 0.4 billion. I have also here the total non-tax revenues for as of August 2010 is 77 billion pesos, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my distinguished colleague, the distinguished sponsor, Mr. Speaker. The only reason why I took pains in really trying to enumerate the numbers, Mr. Speaker, is that the DOF should encourage the GOCCs, Mr. Speaker, let me stress, again, under the official gazette, Mr. Speaker, to make quarterly reports. Let us make this a habit, Mr. Speaker, since the President himself espoused that we should take the righteous path, or in Filipino, ang matawid na daan. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank my distinguished colleague from Davao for his patience and for intelligently answering my questions, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, distinguished sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am honored by the very beautiful words and comments of the gentleman from Davao del Sur. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Majority Leader.